The origins of "And Thus We Existed" as a title for the exhibition come from one of the paintings, which is obviously called "And Thus We Existed." Like many of the titles I use are borrowed from another culture somewhere else, whether be it, in this case, dance music. I was in the studio late at night painting, and on the radio comes a track by a Chicago DJ called Glimpse, and it has this sort of very melancholic sounding voice coming on occasionally in the track saying, "And thus we existed." It's the only words that are repeated in the track. And it just got into my head, and sort of in the way it sort of forms itself in the track, and this sort of rather repetitive, hallucinogenic track is sort of rather wonderful, and sort of, you know, what are we existing from? You know, what were we before, and what have we become? And, you know, have we just suddenly formed at this moment, or what does it mean? Sort of, and it seemed to sum up an awful lot in a very sort of neat but slightly pop way, I suppose, as well, which was nice. And so in some sense it means everything and nothing, like a good title should, I think. It should be open-ended, which I suppose is what I want my paintings to be as well. For the exhibition here, I've coloured the walls in dark greys and red colours, and to some extent I don't want people to pay much attention to those colours. I don't want people to be obsessed with the environment particularly. I don't want them to be too interested in the fact that some of the work is sculpture and some of the work is drawing and some of it's painting. All I want them to do is to have a strong relationship with those individual works. And I'm trying to create an environment which makes it easier for people to engage with the particular work. And I want the person to be in a relaxed mood when looking at the exhibition, and that's why the walls are coloured, and hopefully it feels a little bit more homely than a antiseptic art gallery might. About 7 years ago, I suddenly decided that I had to start drawing. There was not enough drawing in my work. One of the points was that this was supposed to change my paintings, and for a long time it didn't. I was doing the drawings, and then occasionally I would make a painting, and the paintings were still being made in a way that I would have made them 10, 15 years ago, by fundamentally having a starting point as a painting and almost doing a photorealist version of the painting, and then slowly altering this photorealist painting of a photorealist version of an existing painting. Drawing didn't really take any part in it. So this exhibition has work in it that for the first time the entire starting point are drawings, and there's no all this photorealist process that I had before is gone completely, and this now allows me to make layered images, because a lot of the drawings I was making are 2 and 3 layers overlaid over the top, and you're not quite sure what you're looking at. Maybe it'll be a portrait of a man and a figure of a baby, or a portrait of a woman overlaid on top, and they're meant to describe the schizophrenic self, the idea that as individuals we are not wholly one thing. We are very bendable depending on who we're talking to, our environment, our culture. We change all the time. We're mercurial in ourselves. And the drawings, I thought, were doing this very well, but the paintings were still stuck. And this is the first time that I've managed to overpaint the drawings in such a way that I think makes the sort of believable and energetic and colourful, more to the point, painting. And it was a very difficult process to go through, and there was lots of mistakes being made, but I've created 5 or 6 paintings in this exhibition which I think spark a new route for me to take hopefully for a long time, whereby drawing and painting are very combined, and this idea of layering is very much part of the work. In a lot of the new paintings I've made, there are what appears to be very flat brush strokes that are made up of lots of very thin lines, which the line sort of derives in some sense for when you make a painting, and when you make a brush stroke, a brush has hairs on it, and each little hair leaves a little individual line all of its own. And so every brush stroke is made up of lots of little hairs. Or lots of little lines, and therefore it just was the starting point for these more graphic paintings that I've started making, where the lines have become very long and very fluid, and there's this strange mutation between the painted brushstroke and the drawn line. And I want the viewer to sort of look and their eye to move along these long lines and curves, because I don't really do any straight lines in my paintings. They're meant to be very Baroque. But within that sense of movement, you have to create interesting differences of texture and colour. So you have to have sharp points and dull points, and smooth areas and detailed areas, and areas you'd like to caress and areas you wouldn't want to touch. And the painting should be made up of all of these different surfaces, because your eye does caress the surface of the painting, as if your hand would be moving over the surface of it. Black Ships Ate the Sky, the starting point was I had a blank panel to paint on of a particular size, and I often have the panel there and I'm trying to imagine what's going to go on it, what kind of painting I want to make for it. And for some reason I thought I want to make a painting which feels like a 1970 Star Wars poster. It's not that I'm a particular Star Wars fan, but I'm of an age when Star Wars, I suppose, was important culturally to me as a child. And that sense of escapism as an adventure and danger and storytelling, which Star Wars represents, seemed interesting, and especially the way the posters, which were made at the time, were some of the first. Star Wars was very interesting in that it made an awful lot of money, not just from people paying to go and see the Star Wars, but from selling merchandise. And part of the merchandise were posters that were made specifically to go on bedroom walls. You know, children would buy them and put them on the wall. So these were posters made not to advertise the film, because the person buying them would probably have already seen the film, but it was just made as an object to be interesting. And because they weren't advertisements, the title and the word Star Wars and who was in the film was probably just written in quite a small text at the bottom of the poster that could almost be cut off if the person didn't want it, if they just wanted to look at the poster as if it was a painting. And so that was the starting point for having this blank panel at the bottom. It was almost as if it could be cut off, as if it wasn't part of the actual painting. Black Ships Ate the Sky is a series of albums that are made by a British artist and poet called David Tibbett. It's very much about depression, the whole series of albums. And this work, this black, though it's actually not black, I tend not to use black in my work, but it's a very, very dark blue at the bottom, almost represents this psychological sense of depression at the bottom. It's this element which you can't quite cope with. Everything just turns black. So the colour and the freedom of the work that's above sinks down to this element at the bottom, which is just giving up, and the whole world just drawing in and creating this sense of blackness. So the colours even in Black Ships Ate the Sky are very 1970s looking. There's very hyper and oranges and greens and blues, and it has stars in the background. And it's almost like a disco painting. But it's a disco painting, like all good disco, with an element of melancholy somewhere within it, be that within the lyrics of a song or within the rhythm of it. It's about creating differences of tempo and beat and colour and rhythm and an interesting narrative. So yes, it's a melancholic disco painting with science fiction put in there for good measure. The event which started me using antique frames was very definitely an exhibition in the Museo Stefano Bardini in Florence, whereby they have a wonderful collection of Renaissance frames, usually gilded, and they have several walls of these, just a frame hanging within a frame and within a frame very often. So I had photographs of the frames and the exact dimensions, and I often made the drawing to fit exactly into the frame, and then took elements of the frame, the size of the moulding, the rhythm of the curls, maybe they had acanthus leaves or flowers on, or even figures in some cases on the frame, and I would take elements of this and apply it to the drawing. And it was a really enjoyable process because I had this new interesting starting point, which was all of my work is about a relationship and a play with existing artworks and existing other artists, and I'm reacting to what the other artist has already made, and in this case there'll be maybe the subject is a Guido Reni drawing that I'm working from, but then I'm applying aspects of the frame as well on top of the work, and maybe another artist comes in and fits in terms of putting bits of colour in. So I realised I should go out and buy some Renaissance Italian frames and start this process myself, which we did. We travelled to Bologna and Rome and gathered together quite an extensive collection of frames, which have then sort of fed the drawings that I've then made to fill some of these frames. In some of the work in the exhibition, I have made frames specifically. One of the most notable is a painting called the Crystal Elevator in the Palace of God department store. The frame for that looks like it's a 1970s wooden frame. It has a sort of clunky modernist look to it. And the starting point for that is one of my favourite directors, Andreas Tarkovsky, and in his film Solaris, there's a spaceship that above a planet, Solaris, and the planet brings people back to life on board, and you never quite understand why it's bringing people back to life, but the film becomes about memory and recollection and what's real and what isn't real, and how important history is to us, which is very important, and so Russian history becomes tied in with this. For some reason, on board this spaceship, there are 3 Bruegel paintings, and these Bruegel paintings are in these very Russian 1970s frames, and I love this relationship between the 16th century painting and the 1970s frame, that clash, which makes absolute sense in the film because time plays with itself completely within the film. And there's a beautiful point at which the camera is panning across Hunters in the Snow, the Bruegel painting, and you suddenly cut to a point at which one of the scientists on the spaceship is with his wife, who's recently deceased, and you don't quite know where one element, where the painting takes over from real life or vice versa, and you become confused as to where you were because both scenes are set in snow. And I realised it was exactly that which I wanted in my paintings. I wanted you to not understand what was real and what was memory, how our brains mutate reality and store it in a way which, when it returns, is changed and altered and strange, but becomes almost more real than the real thing. Our memories of people are not just visual memories, but they're memories of how people smell, how they sound, what their attitudes was. And when you try and represent a person, you try and represent all those things. And that's why what somebody looks like isn't really that important. It's how they actually were as a whole human being, which is important. And that's what I'm trying to get in my portraits. What a whole human being, inside and outside, is like to display. The first sculptures I made were representations, in some sense, of Frank Auerbach's painting. I was utilising his subject matter and also his way of making marks. Where in most of Frank Auerbach's work, he uses the same size brush throughout the whole painting, which is quite an unusual thing to do, because you think it would be quite boring just to have the same size brush. But you can turn the brush on its side and it sort of makes a slightly thinner mark than it would the other way. But it creates a sense of uniformity, and it creates a holistic sense to the painting. And when you're dealing with something like a sculpture, which is messy because a person can walk around it, it just, having the same size brush throughout the whole sculpture keeps it together, stops it breaking loose and just making a mess. So the starting point was, as I said, Frank Auerbach, and I was making these heads which looked like they were Auerbach heads. With Auerbach's work, with his early work anyway, he was building up the paint on the surface of the canvas. So sometimes the paint would be several centimetres thick on it. And I thought, well, what happens if you take this to its logical conclusion and the paint builds up and builds up and builds up to the point that actually the canvas is irrelevant. The artwork is just the paint. So I wanted to make paintings that were just paint and had just figure and no ground. So the paintings that I ended up making had a plaster, then an acrylic core, and then I would paint lots and lots of oil paint on top of it to create the effect that they were entirely made of oil paint. And there is a lot of oil paint on them. They're actually very heavy because of it. And then I realised that I had some 19th century bronzes, and what happened if I started painting on the bronzes? And in the first ones, the bronze sculptures were just a starting point. They were a way of basically sitting, because I always had trouble with my sculptures of how they sat on a plinth or a table, or on the floor sometimes they were sitting. That meeting point between the table and the sculpture was always awkward. So it's why I got some 19th century sculptures, because they had already ready-made bases and I could apply paint to it, and that was taken care of, the way it sat. And for the first ones, the sculpture was completely covered. You saw no sculpture, no bronze at all, other than this small bit around the bottom. And then as time came on, I revealed more and more of the bronze sculptures and realised that there was a rather nice play going on, that the sense of difference between the 19th century bronze and the 21st century sculpture which I was applying to it was interesting. The bronze was hard and my paint was very soft. The bronze was colourless to an extent, and my paintings were very colourful. The bronze is hard and resilient, and my sculptures are very fragile. And you also have the bronze being sculpture, and my work is painting. So there's all of these opposites with them. So they're fighting with each other, these two. The original 19th century sculpture is fighting, or in some sense making love to my work. And so there's this relationship between the 19th century artist and me, and what I've created going on. And as I said, sometimes it's a fight, and sometimes it's making love, and sometimes it's just a funny whimsical relationship. It's just a conversation. But very often it sort of ends up being quite humorous, that relationship, whereby my painting is absorbing the bronze, or the bronze is trying to struggle with this cloud of paint which is about to envelop it. It has a sort of almost black sense of humour as well, as if the paint is about to smother and eliminate all oxygen from this person which is fighting for life. They're fighting for their own sense of self and their own sense of history. It's yes. So it's the struggle between 19th century figuration and 21st century abstraction to some extent as well.